Imagine standing at the edge of a vast ocean with waves crashing before you and no clear path in sight. You hear a voice calling you to step forward, to walk on the water, to trust beyond what your eyes can see. Would you have the humility to listen? Would you have the courage to obey? This is the life God calls us to. A life of faith that surrenders to His will, not out of weakness, but out of trust. It is not always easy, and it is rarely comfortable, but it is the only path that leads to true purpose, true strength, and true peace. Humility is one of the most misunderstood virtues in the Christian life. Many people mistake it for weakness, self-hatred, or a lack of confidence. But true humility is none of these things. It is the ability to see ourselves accurately in relation to God and others. It does not mean thinking less of ourselves, but thinking of ourselves less. It is not about diminishing our worth, but recognizing that our worth is found in God, not in our own achievements or status. Humility allows us to live in a way that is free from the burden of self-importance, giving us the ability to serve, to love, and to trust God more deeply. At the heart of humility is the understanding that we are created by God and utterly dependent on Him. Every good thing we have, our talents, our resources, our opportunities, comes from His hand. When we truly grasp this, pride begins to lose its grip on us. Instead of seeing ourselves as self-made, we acknowledge that we are God-made. Instead of seeking constant recognition, we are content to let God be glorified. The Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 4 verse 7, "For who makes you different from anyone else? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did not?" This verse strikes at the core of pride, reminding us that everything we have is a gift from God. When we recognize this, we begin to see humility not as a burden, but as a pathway to true joy and freedom. One of the greatest dangers of pride is that it distorts reality. It tempts us to believe we are more important, more capable, or more righteous than we really are. Pride leads us to compare ourselves to others, making us feel either superior or insecure, depending on how we measure up. But humility grounds us in truth. It allows us to see that we are neither greater nor lesser than we truly are. We are valuable, but not because of our own greatness. Our value comes from being children of God. We are loved, but not because we have earned it. Our love comes from the grace of God. We are called, but not because we are the best choice. God uses the weak to shame the strong, and the foolish to shame the wise. Jesus provides the perfect example of humility. Though He was God Himself, He did not cling to His divine rights, but took on human flesh, lived as a servant, and humbled Himself even to the point of death on a cross. Philippians 2:5-7 says, "In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to His own advantage. He made Himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness." This is true humility, not denying one's greatness, but choosing to use it for the service of others. Jesus did not need to make Himself appear weak or insignificant, but He willingly put aside His divine privileges for the sake of saving humanity. If the Son of God could humble Himself in this way, how much more should we, who are mere creations, embrace humility in our own lives? One of the greatest tests of humility is how we respond to correction and criticism. A proud person rejects correction because they believe they are always right. A humble person is willing to listen, to learn, and to admit mistakes. This does not mean that we must accept every criticism without question, but it does mean having a heart that is open to growth. Pride says, "I have nothing to learn," but humility says, "There is always more to understand." When we cultivate this attitude, we not only grow spiritually, but we also become more compassionate and patient with others. Another mark of humility is a willingness to serve without seeking recognition. The world tells us that status and success are measured by how many people serve us, but Jesus turned this idea upside down. He told his disciples that the greatest among them must be the servant of all. When we serve without expecting praise, when we do good even when no one is watching, we reflect the heart of Christ. A humble person does not need the approval of others because they are secure in God's approval. Humility also strengthens our faith. When we rely too much on our own abilities, we leave little room for God to work in our lives. But when we acknowledge our need for Him, we position ourselves to receive His grace and power. James 4:6 tells us, "God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble." This means that pride not only distances us from others, but it also creates a barrier between us and God. When we humble ourselves, we invite God's guidance, wisdom, and strength into our lives. Humility frees us from the exhausting need to prove ourselves. It allows us to rest in the security of God's love, knowing that our worth does not come from our success, our reputation, or our abilities. It comes from Him alone. When we embrace this truth, we are free to love others without competition, to serve without seeking recognition, and to trust God without fear. Courage is often misunderstood as the absence of fear, but in reality, it is the ability to act in faith despite fear. Fear is a natural human response to danger, uncertainty, and suffering. But courage is what enables us to move forward even when our hearts tremble. Biblical courage is not reckless bravado or blind optimism, but a deep and abiding trust in God. It is the strength to stand firm when the world tells us to compromise, the willingness to obey God when obedience is costly, and the ability to trust His promises when everything around us seems to be falling apart. One of the greatest examples of courage in Scripture is found in Joshua. After the death of Moses, Joshua was given the enormous task of leading the Israelites into the Promised Land. This was no easy mission. The land was filled with strong nations, fortified cities, and powerful armies. Yet God commanded Joshua not to be afraid. In Joshua 1-9, God declares, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." God did not tell Joshua that there would be no battles or that the path would be easy, but He assured him that His presence would be with him. This is the foundation of true courage, not the absence of fear, but the certainty of God's presence. The courage is the courage, not the absence of fear, but the certainty of God's presence. Fear, when left unchecked, has a way of paralyzing us. It whispers lies that keep us from stepping into what God has called us to do. It tells us that we are not strong enough, that failure is inevitable, that obedience is too risky. The Israelites themselves fell into this trap when they first approached the Promised Land. Despite having seen God's mighty power in Egypt, they allowed fear to consume them when they saw the giants in the land. Instead of trusting in God's promises, they focused on their own weakness. Because of this, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, missing out on the blessings that could have been theirs. This is what fear does. It robs us of God's best. True courage does not come from self-confidence, but from God-confidence. Many people think that being brave means believing in yourself, but Scripture teaches that real courage comes from believing in God. When David faced Goliath, he did not rely on his own strength, skill, or experience. He was just a shepherd boy, untrained in warfare. Yet he had absolute confidence that God would give him victory. In 1 Samuel 17:45, David boldly declares to Goliath, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." David's courage was not rooted in his own ability, but in God's power. One of the most challenging aspects of courage is that it often requires us to stand alone. The world pressures us to conform, to remain silent, to avoid discomfort. But biblical courage means standing firm in truth, even when it is unpopular. The three Hebrew men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, faced this test when King Nebuchadnezzar commanded them to bow to a golden statue. They could have reasoned that it was just a small compromise, that they could bow outwardly while remaining faithful in their hearts. But they refused to worship anything other than God, even under the threat of being thrown into a fiery furnace. Their response in Daniel 3:17-18 is a model of true courage. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your Majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of God you have set up. This is the essence of biblical courage, not just trusting God for deliverance, but being willing to obey him even if deliverance does not come. Courage is also essential in the small daily decisions of life. It takes courage to speak the truth when lies are more convenient. It takes courage to forgive when bitterness feels justified. It takes courage to love when rejection is a possibility. It takes courage to remain faithful when temptation calls us to compromise. Many people think of courage only in terms of great battles or dramatic moments, but often the greatest acts of courage are found in quiet obedience, choosing to trust God when we do not understand, choosing to keep praying when answers do not come, choosing to keep walking in faith when the path is unclear. These are the moments where true courage is forged. One of the beautiful things about courage is that it grows through use. The more we step out in faith, the more we experience God's faithfulness, and the more our courage strengthens. Just as a muscle becomes stronger through exercise, so too does our ability to trust God in the face of fear. This is why God often calls us into situations that stretch us beyond our natural abilities. He wants us to rely on His strength, not our own. Fear will always try to hold us back, but courage calls us to step forward. It reminds us that God is greater than any obstacle, that His promises are more certain than our doubts, and that His presence is enough for whatever lies ahead. Pride is one of the most dangerous and deceptive sins because it distorts our perception of reality. It blinds us to our weaknesses, exaggerates our strengths, and distances us from God. Pride is often seen as self-confidence, but in its true form, it is self-exaltation. The belief that we are independent of God, that we know better than Him, and that our ways are superior. It was pride that caused Satan to fall, pride that led Adam and Eve to eat the forbidden fruit, and pride that continues to be the root of many sins in the world. Pride makes people believe they do not need God, and once that thought takes root, all other sins follow. It is no surprise that Proverbs 16:18 warns, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." When a person becomes too confident in themselves and forgets their dependence on God, their downfall is inevitable. One of the greatest dangers of pride is that it destroys both humility and courage. It does this by distorting our understanding of ourselves and our dependence on God. When pride takes hold, people become either arrogant or insecure. Arrogance is the belief that we are greater than we are, that we do not need guidance, correction, or help. It makes us resistant to advice, defensive when corrected, and unwilling to admit our faults. It causes people to look down on others, thinking they are more important, more talented, or more worthy. This kind of pride is obvious, but there is another form of pride that is just as dangerous: the pride of insecurity. Insecurity seems like humility on the surface, but it is actually pride in disguise. It keeps people from stepping out in faith because they are too concerned with their own weaknesses. Instead of relying on God, they focus on their failures, making themselves the center of their thoughts instead of trusting in His power. Whether through arrogance or insecurity, pride prevents people from fully surrendering to God's will. Pride not only affects our relationship with God, but also our relationship with others. It creates conflict, fuels jealousy, and makes it difficult for people to live in unity. When pride dominates a person's heart, they struggle to forgive because they feel superior to those who have wronged them. They seek recognition for their good deeds instead of serving selflessly. They compare themselves to others, either feeling superior or resenting those who have more. This competitive and self-sacrifice mindset destroys love, because love is not about self-exaltation, it is about self-giving. 1 Corinthians 13:4-5 says, "Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs." True love cannot coexist with pride, because pride demands attention, while love seeks to serve. Pride also robs people of courage. While it may seem that proud people are confident, their confidence is based on a fragile foundation, their own strength and ability. When difficulties arise, they either refuse to acknowledge their need for help, or they crumble under the weight of their limitations. Pride makes people afraid of failure, afraid of looking weak, and afraid of surrendering control. This is why proud people often avoid challenges that might expose their weaknesses. They do not step out in faith because they do not want to risk humiliation. They do not stand for truth because they fear rejection. They do not follow God's leading because they want to be in control. Pride convinces people that they must always appear strong, but true courage comes from admitting weakness and trusting in God's strength. The most powerful example of humility and courage overcoming pride is found in Jesus. He had every reason to exalt himself. As the Son of God, he had the right to demand worship, honor, and obedience. He chose the path of humility. He washed the feet of his disciples. He associated with the lowly, and he endured the shame of the cross. He did not seek his own glory, but only the glory of the Father. In Philippians 2:8 it says, "And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross." This is the ultimate contrast to pride. Jesus did not fear humiliation, he did not demand recognition, and he did not avoid suffering. His humility and courage led him to the cross, and through that act of self-sacrifice, he achieved the greatest victory. Pride is the great enemy of both humility and courage because it keeps people focused on themselves rather than on God. It convinces them that they must rely on their own strength, that their worth is based on human recognition, and that admitting weakness is failure. But the truth is that humility is strength, and true courage comes from surrendering to God. Only when people let go of their pride can they experience the full power of His grace. Obedience to God requires both humility and courage. It is not simply about following a set of rules or doing what is easy. True obedience is an act of surrender, a recognition that God's ways are higher than our own, and a willingness to trust Him even when His commands seem difficult or unclear. Obedience demands humility because it requires acknowledging that God's wisdom is greater than ours. It demands courage because it often means stepping into the unknown, facing opposition, or making sacrifices that challenge our comfort. Without humility, a person will resist God's authority, believing they know best. Without courage, they will hesitate when obedience requires them to go against their fears, desires, or the expectations of others. Throughout Scripture, obedience is a mark of true faith. It is not enough to believe in God intellectually. Faith is proven through action. Abraham demonstrated this when he was called to leave his homeland and journey to an unknown land. God did not give him all the details or assurances of what would come, but Abraham obeyed because he trusted God. In Genesis 12:01, God commanded him, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." Abraham had every reason to hesitate. He was leaving behind familiarity, security, and everything he had known. Yet his obedience was an act of both humility and courage. He humbled himself by submitting to God's will rather than his own understanding, and he acted with courage by stepping forward in faith despite the uncertainties ahead. Obedience is often costly. It is easy to follow God when His commands align with our desires, but true obedience is tested when it requires sacrifice. This was evident in the life of Moses. When God called him to lead Israel out of Egypt, Moses hesitated. He feared failure, doubted his abilities, and questioned whether people would listen to him. Yet God assured him that obedience was not about his own strength, but about God's power working through him. In Exodus 4:12, God told him, "Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." Moses had to humble himself by setting aside his insecurities and accept that God's strength was sufficient. He also had to act with courage, facing Pharaoh and leading a nation despite the many obstacles ahead. If Moses had allowed his fear or pride to control him, he would have missed his calling. But because he chose obedience, God used him to deliver an entire people from slavery. Obedience is not always about great and dramatic acts. Often, it is about faithfulness in small things. Many people want to follow God when the calling is grand and noticeable. But true obedience begins in the daily choices. It is about speaking truth even when lying would be easier. It is about loving an enemy when bitterness seems justified. It is about trusting God's timing when impatience tempts us to take control. It is about resisting sin even when no one is watching. These small acts of obedience shape a person's character and prepare them for greater challenges. A person who is not faithful in small things will struggle to be faithful when God calls them to something greater. Obedience to God often brings opposition. The world does not value submission to God's authority, and those who choose to live in obedience will face resistance. Daniel experienced this when he refused to stop praying to God despite the king's decree. He could have justified compromise, reasoning that he could pray in secret or just wait until the danger passed. But his obedience was not based on convenience. He was willing to risk everything to remain faithful. When he was thrown into the lion's den, God delivered him, showing that obedience, even when costly, is always honored by God. One of the greatest obstacles to obedience is the desire for control. People naturally want to determine their own path, make their own decisions, and follow their own wisdom. But true obedience means surrendering control to God, trusting that He sees what we cannot see and knows what is best. This does not mean that obedience will always be easy, or that God will always explain everything in advance. Sometimes He calls people to obey, even when they do not fully understand why. This is where faith is truly tested. Will a person trust God's plan, even when it does not make sense? Will they obey, even when the road ahead is uncertain? Jesus Himself modeled perfect obedience. He did not seek His own will, but fully submitted to the Father, even when it led Him to the cross. In Luke 22:42, He prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will but yours be done." This is the ultimate picture of humility and courage in obedience. Jesus humbled Himself by accepting the Father's will above His own, and He showed courage by enduring the suffering required for the salvation of humanity. His obedience was not easy, but it was necessary. Because of His submission, the greatest victory in history was won. Obedience is not just about following commands. It is about trusting God's wisdom, submitting to His authority, and stepping forward in faith despite challenges. It is the mark of true discipleship, and it is through obedience that a person experiences the fullness of God's plan and purpose for their life. Faith is the foundation of the Christian life. It is not merely an intellectual agreement with the truth of God's existence. It is a deep and unwavering trust in His character, His promises, and His power. Faith is what allows a person to walk in obedience, persevere through trials, and step into the unknown with confidence. It is not based on emotions or circumstances, but on the certainty that God is faithful and His word is true. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, for faith is the bridge between human weakness and divine strength. It is through faith that believers receive salvation, find peace in uncertainty, and remain steadfast when everything around them is shaking. As Hebrews 11:01 declares, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see." True faith goes beyond what is visible or logical. It trusts in God's unseen hand at work. Faith requires humility because it acknowledges human limitation. To have faith means recognizing that we do not have all the answers, that we are not in control, and that our wisdom is insufficient. Pride resists faith because it seeks to rely on human understanding and self-sufficiency. This is why faith and humility are inseparable. Faith begins where self-reliance ends. When a person humbles themselves before God, they are able to trust Him fully, knowing that His wisdom is far greater than theirs. This was the lesson Job learned in his suffering. He did not understand why he was experiencing loss, pain, and hardship, but in the end he surrendered to the truth that God's ways are beyond human comprehension. In Job 42:2 and 3 he confesses, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, "Who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge?" Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. Faith does not demand full understanding. It rests in the assurance that God knows what He is doing. Faith also requires courage because it often calls people to step into the unknown. God's plans frequently lead His people beyond their comfort zones, requiring them to trust in His guidance, even when the path is unclear. This was true for Peter when Jesus called him to walk on water. As long as Peter kept his eyes on Jesus, he was able to do the impossible. But the moment he focused on the wind and waves, fear overtook him and he began to sink. His experience reveals an important truth. Faith is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate one's actions. Fear looks at the storm, but faith looks at the one who is greater than the storm. Faith is not passive, it is active. It does not simply wait for God to move, but takes bold steps in response to His word. Abraham did not wait until he saw the promised land before believing God's promise. He set out before knowing where he was going. The walls of Jericho did not fall before Israel marched around them. They fell because Israel acted in obedience. The woman with the issue of blood was not healed by standing still. She pressed through the crowd to touch Jesus' garment. Faith is demonstrated through action, and it is in the act of trusting that God's power is revealed. James 2:17 reminds us, "Faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead." True faith does not sit on the sidelines. It moves forward, even when the outcome is uncertain. Faith also sustains believers through suffering. Trials test the strength of faith, revealing whether it is rooted in circumstances or in God's unchanging character. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego displayed this kind of faith when they refused to bow to Nebuchadnezzar's statue, even under the threat of death. Their response was not conditional faith, trusting God only if He delivered them, but absolute faith, declaring that even if He did not rescue them, they would still serve Him. This is the kind of faith that endures through hardship, knowing that God is faithful whether or not He answers prayers in the expected way. Faith does not guarantee a life free of difficulties, but it does guarantee that God will be with His people in the midst of them. It allows believers to stand firm when the world is shaken, to trust in God's goodness when circumstances seem unfair, and to walk forward with confidence even when the future is uncertain. Faith is not just believing that God exists. It is living in full trust that He is who He says He is, that He will do what He has promised, and that He is always working for the good of those who love Him. Surrendering to God's will is one of the greatest acts of humility and courage a person can make. It requires laying down personal desires, ambitions, and control, trusting that God's plan is better than anything one could create for themselves. Surrender is not weakness. It is a declaration that God's wisdom is higher, His timing is perfect, and His ways are beyond human understanding. It is an act of faith that acknowledges He is sovereign over all things, including the course of a person's life. Many struggle with surrender because they fear the unknown, worry about losing control, or hesitate to let go of their own plans. But true surrender is not about loss. It is about gaining something far greater, God's perfect will and purpose. Jesus is the ultimate example of surrender. He did not come to do His own will, but to fulfill the will of the Father. Every step He took, Every word he spoke and every miracle he performed was in obedience to God's plan. In the Garden of Gethsemane, faced with the agony of the cross, Jesus prayed in Luke 22:42, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will but yours be done." This was not a passive resignation, but an active submission. This was not a passive resignation, but an active submission. He acknowledged his human suffering, but ultimately entrusted himself to the Father's perfect plan. This is what surrender looks like. Not the absence of struggle, but the decision to trust God completely, even when the path ahead is difficult. Surrender requires humility because it acknowledges that God knows better than we do. People often hold tightly to their own plans, believing they know what is best for their lives. But Proverbs 3:5-6 instructs, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight." Leaning on one's own understanding is a form of pride, assuming that human wisdom is sufficient, but God sees what humans cannot see. He knows the beginning from the end, and his perspective is eternal. Surrender means setting aside personal logic and trusting that his guidance is always right. Surrender also requires courage because it often leads into the unknown. When God calls someone to let go of their own plans, it can feel like stepping off the edge of a cliff without knowing what is below. This was the case with Abraham when God told him to sacrifice Isaac. Everything in Abraham's mind would have told him that this command did not make sense. Isaac was the son of promise, the one through whom God had said he would make a great nation. But Abraham did not hesitate. He trusted that God's plan was greater even when he could not understand it. Because of his surrender, God provided a ram in place of Isaac, proving that his ways are higher and his provision is perfect. Surrendering to God's will often means letting go of personal ambitions. Many people have dreams, goals, and desires that they have worked hard to achieve. But sometimes God's calling leads in a different direction. It may require giving up a career path, leaving behind familiar surroundings, or stepping into a role that feels uncomfortable. This is not because God wants to take away good things, but because he has something better. When Peter, James, and John left their fishing nets to follow Jesus, they were not just leaving behind their livelihood, they were surrendering their entire future. They had no guarantee of where they would go, what they would do, or how they would survive. But their surrender led them into the greatest calling of their lives, to be disciples of Christ and witnesses to the world. One of the greatest barriers to surrender is fear. People fear losing control, fear suffering, or fear that God's plan will lead them somewhere they do not want to go. But fear and trust cannot coexist. To fully surrender, a person must believe that God's love is perfect and that he will never lead them into something that is not for their ultimate good. This does not mean that surrender is easy or that it will not involve challenges. It does mean that whatever God asks, he will provide the strength to endure, the grace to walk through it, and the peace that surpasses all understanding. Surrendering to God's will is a daily act. It is not a one-time decision, but a continuous choice to trust him in every moment. It means surrendering not only the big decisions, but also the small ones. How to spend time, how to respond to others, how to navigate struggles, and how to remain faithful even when life does not go as planned. The more a person surrenders, the more they experience the freedom that comes from walking in alignment with God's purpose. There is no safer place to be than in the center of his will, For his plans are always good, his love is always sure, and his grace is always enough. Humility and courage are inseparable in the life of a believer. God calls his people to walk in both, not as separate virtues, but as two sides of the same faith. True humility recognizes that he is sovereign, that his wisdom is higher, and that apart from him, nothing can be accomplished. True courage steps forward in obedience, trusting in his strength, even when the path is uncertain. Faith requires both, humility to submit to his will and courage to act upon it. Obedience is the proof of faith, tested in small and great moments alike. Surrender is not about losing control, but about placing trust in the hands of the one who holds all things. When fear rises, when the world opposes, when doubts creep in, the answer is always the same. Humble yourself before God, take courage in his promises, and move forward in faith. This is the life he calls his children to live, a life fully yielded to him, walking in trust and standing firm in the knowledge that he is faithful.